things, but it's challenging to me because if we truly had a true stake in this endeavor called the United States, why do we have to work so hard to be treated like we're citizens? And in fact, if we look at it, when slavery ended, there was another institution put in place to ensure that we would not succeed. That was called sharecropping and convict leasing. And sharecropping, the way sharecropping worked, you rented the land from the former enslaver and got food and seeds and provisions and clothing and all of the tools and things you need on credit, and hope that each year the crop came in. And when the crop didn't come in, because he was lending you money and leasing you the land and charging you interest, oftentimes we went deeper and deeper and deeper in debt. And sharecropping went on from 1865 well into the 1960s. And in fact, when we think about the migration of people of African descent to places like Detroit, there were oftentimes cases we were fleeing sharecropping situations. There was also something called convict leasing, where if for whatever reason we found ourselves in the hands of the penal system or the law, or just arrested for some minor incident in the county jail, oftentimes we could be leased out to the former people who enslaved us. And unfortunately or fortunately, even though slavery was over, they still needed people to pick cotton and work the land. So they had to find another source of cheap and free labor. So we had sharecropping and convict leasing. Another institution designed to keep us or to relegate us to a lesser place in the society. Sharecropping, convict leasing lasts well into the 1960s. So convict leasing didn't last quite as long. Massive success from 1865 to 1877. 1877 Detroit, former enslaved Africans, newly free Africans had massive success in every realm of life. Private sector, public sector, we were elected to offices at every branch of government, every level of government, all the way up to senator and governor. There was massive pushback against Reconstruction. This is when you get the rise of the Klan and other organizations like this. You see, for a short period after Reconstruction, we have what's called the post-Reconstruction era, I think it's called formally. And from 1879, and finally when we get to 1896, of course, decision which creates a whole nother called liberation or Jim Crow, which lasted from 1954. You have a legal decision that begins the era of legal segregation, and another. And one step of the way, we've had continuous efforts through various institutions that are being used to oppress us, but effort to try to be a part. 1954, you get Brown versus Board of Education. Desegregation, integration theoretically is made legal. Let's see, 19 of education, integration. Less than 20 years later, with the era of mass incarceration, now these are ways that institutions are being used to African descent and other people of color. The Civil Rights era, and there's controversy over where the Civil Rights era began. Some people on the Board of Education, I challenge that because we were the 15th Amendment. So Civil War, Brown versus Board of various civil rights. Oftentimes, a lot of what many again begins in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. I think 55 is the ground struggling. What had loose affiliations? They go back to the late 20s, early 30s, and they had a youth chapter. Do not know that they had.
Well, you made covenant. Okay,
Were you born in the South?
Yes, when I was 6 years old.
Oh, okay.
In Detroit.
But convict, did you get convict leasing? And this was really, and when slavery ended, many of us that our ambitions, a priority for us was going around the South looking for our relative trouble with the law, like they had vagrancy laws, not vagrancy, but vagrancy. And if I couldn't prove that I could be in Highland Park, to use the prisoners as laborers.
Releasing themselves from.
Because if you wound up in jail, then you could be rented out by. Anyhow, we got which is so well documented in the documentary 30, including the institutions of the United States, black people and other people of color. And what we're seeing, families coming from Guatemala and other Central American countries, we now have, actually we've always had white offices. In fact, the institutions, the offices themselves are racist institutions. But what has happened historically, like Madonna, and yes, I can say that, is that, and a lot of us put power and effort, and I would never, it even has more limitations if we don't understand institution of power. We vote to a degree, but to maximize avowed, overt white supremacy controlling every branch of the federal branch of local governments, avowed, overt racists who have an agenda, is global. It's often referred to as the global nationalism. And what this is tied to, bringing it back locally, as in local to the United States, and I haven't heard anybody talk about in recent time how these immigration policies are a direct response to the fact that white people as a political entity in this country are declining in terms of their numbers, and they're fearful that brown people, meaning Latino, Hispanic, whichever term you prefer, are increasingly becoming the larger number of people in American demographics. And they are so fearful that they will lose their power due to the increase of people, Hispanics and Latinos. I use both because some people prefer either or, and some say one is more derogatory or the other. So this is massive pushback. But what these people have done, what they continue to do, is they control the institutions that enable them to do things like enact a policy that tears children from their families, that separates families. It's a very common story amongst people of African descent, going all the way back to the transatlantic slave trade. They control the institutions. The Department of Justice is probably the most advanced or highest form of law enforcement institution in this country. The court system. The Congress is an institution. The executive branch of government is an institution. And it's through these institutions that, if you don't like the existing policies and laws, you can change them to serve your interests. And this is what we see happening today. And going back to this concept of global conservative nationalism, this had everything to do with the UK leaving the European Union and the issues with France. If you listen to Donald Trump, he talks about it all the time, how Europe is not doing this, that, and the other, and because they're lax with their migration laws, all these people are coming in and all of this. What this is really about is white supremacists trying to hold on to their power. Anyhow, I have just a little bit of time left, and I will come back to that again and again and again. But this is pushback, and this is a very clear case and example of people using power. It's just a perfect example of how power really works and how people should use their power. I'm not saying I support what they're doing, but they're using the institutions and their power to work their agenda. And if we're going to participate in the political process, we have to better, I think, not just those of us that vote or participate on that level, but even those of us that are active in the political process as politicians. We don't have people that now, not many, that are running for office based on the idea that they have an obligation to bring something back to their people. People like Coleman Alexander Young, Irma Henderson, Joanne Watson. We don't have those kind of people in office. We're in a different era. Anyhow, going back to music, last week, I know that may be an abrupt shift. If anybody have any comments or questions, those of you that are viewing on Facebook, you can shoot them up on the screen and I'll respond. Those of us in the listening audience, the viewing audience, the numbers on the screen, 313-868-4336, 313-868-0351. Call in, just as I took the last call. I'll take any other inquiries, questions, comments, or whatever. But last week when I began the presentation on black music, which is all African music for me, and I interchangeably use black and African because for me it's only two type of black folks, the two type of African folks. You're either diasporic or continental. Of course, if you want to debate that, you can call in. We can talk about that as well. But in the presentation earlier, which I didn't finish, and I'll continue tonight, I may not get it all in, I identified three categories of African American music. African American sacred traditions, which is gospel music and all of that. I kind of talked about it. I don't want to go backwards, but I'm kind of recapping the ones that I talked about. African American secular. So you have sacred music and secular. And this is a Western concept of how we look at music. Any music that is not gospel or spiritual or sacred music, as in worship, is considered secular music. Then I had sacred traditions, secular traditions, also the sacred traditions, and where I stopped more than this, but the ones I had mentioned last week were ragtime, which emerges and spans from the 1880s to. Then there was a transition from New Orleans jazz into big band, popular in the 1920s and 30s. I'll talk more about that when we how it evolved and emerged here. Going into what hard bebop is one of the most prevalent. Out of bebop emerges the hard jazz fusion. Aspects of the African origins. A lot of this Africanisms in American culture, which is an edited volume by Joseph Levin of The Evolution of Africa, which begins in Africa and continues to exist in American culture. So the African origins of African American music. Key points captured in songs and dance traditions with them to Americans. Even though they were suppressed, and they're singing, and interestingly, music losing. Don't believe the high evening, and including drums, various. You have to think or know that the first Africans that were 1865, more of our African culture, the traditional African singing and dance. In countries where Catholicism was the enslaved various manners hide the religion or disguise it, unable to go from being a colonization. Traditional Africans is everywhere. The people there, not hieroglyphics. They didn't call it hieroglyphics. That's an imposed term. They called it Medunetter. Hieroglyphics mean picture writing. Compare that to divine speech, the language Medunefer. Last week. Work songs. The practice was transferred or transplanted with those Africans bought in a village, say maybe in Guinea, where the djembe was played, balafon, things like this. In a village, if we had maybe 20 people in a village or a compound, when it was time to harvest crops and doing their own thing individually, the people would collectively do this. So we maybe would one day or one weekend be at the Chike compound or at our to harvest the crops for everybody. And this would be a communal and collective effort. But the music was there to help make the work less tedious. So many, if we can, on the phone place, because something about listening to music helps to make work less tedious. So we had work songs. The work songs emerged out of the work activity in the fields, prisons, on roadsides, and the waterfront and railroads of America. Work songs provided a sense of physical relief from the tedium of work. These songs also depicted the worker's situation and built on a sense. Work songs also more appropriately system of enslavement. The idea that we were not human, we were chattel, we were like a cow, a goat, or a machine, not human. We were less than human. But identity and a sense of Get Up Stand Up show. Could you tell us your name and offer a...
You mentioned, I believe that was Tuesday evening. I have in my study depended on two types of people. Those that are born of the Spirit of God that is, they're connected to the source and they have the peace from within. Those that are not born again, that do not have the Holy Spirit, they are externally motivated. Those are the types that want to listen to say to fill the vacant spaces of a motivated person. That would be an annoyance to someone from the spirit, from the inner to the outer.
Okay.
We have two different types of individuals here. The internally motivated, which are born of internally motivated.
Okay. I appreciate your comment. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Thanks. Have a good evening. The spirituals reflected the new religious views of enslaved Africans. Now, you have to remember, we came here with traditional religion. Oftentimes, we think, well, those were satanic, evil. I had experience as I was preparing for the event we had this Saturday, where somebody said to me that they were going to come. I'm not going to ever reveal this person because I have respect, care, and love and concern for them. But they felt like to participate in this ceremony would be like the equivalent of worshiping a God other than Jesus. Africans came to the Americas and other places that we were taken to with full spiritual orientation, full spirit Christian. Some came as Christian, some came as Muslim. Practices that was neither Islam or Christian is as valid as anybody's, and of course this makes creates a purpose, tyranny, and violence. We embraced Christianity, and we, in fact, of course, a topic for another conversation or another class. So we developed, to what we could do here, to the language we were being given. And we created spirituals, and these spirituals sometimes were called sorrow songs. This was a term coined, I don't know if it was coined, but it was made popular by W.E.B. Du Bois in his book, The Souls of Black Folks, which was, I think, published in 1903. And The Souls of Black Folks gives a glimpse into the culture of African people in America, or what some people call the American Negro. He called them sorrow songs, and in fact, one of the chapters deal with the sorrow songs of the Negro. I forget the exact chapter. Spirituals conveyed a message to the world of the enslaved faith in the ultimate justice in the world. So you see, as we embrace this revised religion, we were some of the strongest adherents to it, because we knew where we came from, what God was, who God was, and that God was real. As we were forced to adjust how we dealt with religion here, we, through the spirituals, were able to resonate or voice the power of God. Spirituals served as a reflection of the enslaved Africans to maintain their dignity, personality, and human spirit. The spirituals were social, religious, and socio-religious. Spirituals expressed the desire for freedom, justice, and penalty for the oppressor. And probably the best way that this can be illustrated, at least from my perspective, is that we took the story, particularly the story of the Israelites and their said captivity in Egypt, to be a metaphor for our captivity in the wilderness of America. And we saw the slave master, the white man, or however you want to see it, the oppressor, as the equivalent of Moses. And part of our plea was, Pharaoh, let my people go. The spirituals also convey criticism of the existing order, and they oftentimes contain coded messages of escape, secret meetings, and struggle. And the spiritual Swing Low, Sweet Chariot is probably the best example of that, because that was used oftentimes when somebody like Harriet Tubman was coming to a plantation or close, coming to help get some people and help lead them to freedom. I don't know how it went back to work songs. After we get the work songs, these were field hollers. They were sung during work time. They eased the tedium of the work, and they promoted unity and reinforced the humanity of the enslaved. You also have early on the emergence of the blues. The blues emerged from the work songs and the field hollers performed by enslaved Africans. Some minds to the exploitation, loss of love, bad news, bad dreams, loving hard, and reaffirmation and durability. Major themes in the blues include beautiful women, being down and out, sexual betrayal, plea bargaining, social criticism. Key figures in blues were William Handy, Ma Rainey, Billie Holiday, and John Lee Hooker. And I'm going to stop at the blues because we're out of time. When we meet again next week, we'll continue. The next in this evolution of black music is gospel, so I'll start there. And you've been viewing TV 33 WHPR. This is the Get Up Stand Up Show with Minister Malik Shabazz. This is the Black in the Day and the 313 segment, an Afrocentric perspective of African and African American history and phenomena, when and where it occurs. We thank you for tuning in. We thank the Facebook people in TV land, on the internet. We thank you for tuning in. We ask you to continue to watch and join. Stay tuned the next 3 days for the Get Up Stand. Baba Kafense Chike, and as always, we close by saying, up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will.